The oil lamp on the stone table flickered with a hesitant light as it cast long and jagged shadows across the courtyard of the palace in Ithaca. The night was exactly the kind that should have been perfect for sleeping because it was warm and still with the scent of sun-baked dust and salt hanging in the air. Yet Odysseus sat on a low stone bench with his elbows on his knees while his mind flatly refused to drop anchor. He had been sitting there for many hours as he watched the stars wheel slowly overhead exactly like those sheep in the cave of the Polyphemus. He looked at the empty spaces in the pen and realized that something really had to be done about the livestock because most of his finest flocks had been devoured by the suitors while he was away. It was a practical mess that a king should probably sort out with some dignity, although the thought flickered and then darted away like a frightened lizard. What happened to Odysseus after the Odyssey? Tonight we follow him into a chapter of his life that was once written down and then somehow lost to time. It is easy to see why it was forgotten since one probably has to live a fair amount of years to understand why anyone would be interested in the story of a man who had already finished his wars only to shoulder an oar and begin walking inland. But perhaps that is exactly where the interest truly begins. Before you drift into sleep, discover this tale of how difficult it is to truly come home, and why sometimes a man must walk away once more just to finally understand who he is. The world saw in him a legend, and a hero who always carried a pocketful of clever answers for every riddle. Yet in truth, he was merely a tired soul who wished for nothing more than for the gods to misplace his name, so they might grant him just one night of unremarkable quiet. Although he had returned to his hearth a victor, he had brought home a silence that was louder than any storm and a prophecy from Tiresias, which seemed determined to deny him the simple and well-earned right to a peaceful life. He heard soft footsteps on the stone floor and did not have to look up to know who it was. Only one person in the palace walked with that particular rhythm, which was steady and unhurried as the footsteps of someone who had been walking these same stones for 50 years. Still awake, my little sunbeam? Eurycleus' voice was as warm as the sun-drenched side of a ripe apricot in the garden of old Autolycus. It was the same voice that had sung him lullabies when he was a boy, and the same voice that had scolded him when he stole honey from the pantry. She settled onto the bench beside him with the small groan of an old woman who had spent too many years on her feet, and she looked at him with those sharp and knowing eyes that never missed a thing. "I thought you would be sleeping, Nanny Euryclea," he said while he kept his gaze fixed on the flickering wick. "I could say the same to you," she replied as she reached out to pat his hand. "You have been out here every night for a week, and Penelope is starting to worry." She does not say it out loud because she is a woman of great patience, but I can see it in the way she looks at you whenever you stare at the horizon instead of your wine. Odysseus finally lifted his head and gave her a tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Penelope worries about everything because that is what she has practiced for 20 years. She worried when I was gone, and she worried when I came back, and now she worries because I cannot sleep. I think she would find something to worry about even if I slept as soundly as a stone. "Don't you be clever with me," Eurycleus said, although there was no heat in her tone. "I have known you since you were small enough to fit in one hand, and I have wiped your nose and changed your swaddling clothes. I have seen you come home covered in blood and glory, and I have seen you come home as a beggar, so you cannot fool me with that hero's smile. What is keeping you awake, my boy?" Odysseus was silent for a long moment as he stared at the oil lamp while the flame danced and flickered in the light breeze. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the old woman had ever heard it because it carried the weight of the underworld itself. "I dream of the dead, Euryclea, and I see the faces of everyone I have ever lost every single night when I close my eyes. I see my mother standing on the banks of the Styx, and I see Achilles, who was the greatest of us all, and even Agamemnon, who was a great fool in life and remains a sour ghost in death. But mostly I see Tiresias, who gave me my home back only to tell me that I would never truly be able to keep it. Euryclea made a small sound of understanding, which was the kind of noise a woman makes when she knows she cannot fix a broken world, but wants you to know she is listening nonetheless. She reached over and took his hand, while her fingers felt dry and warm and papery with age, just like the ancient scrolls in the palace archives. The blind prophet told you that you would return home, and you did, but he also spoke of a journey that was not yet finished, she said softly as she squeezed his hand. He told you that to find peace you would have to take an oar on your shoulder and walk inland to a place where no one knows the sea, so you could make a sacrifice to Poseidon. It does not sound so terrible to me, since a little walk and a few prayers have mended many a man's soul before. Odysseus laughed, but there was no joy in it because it sounded more like the rattling of dry bones. It is not the walk that frightens me, my dear Nanny, but the realization that I am a stranger in my own house. I look at Penelope, and I see 20 years of waiting carved into her face, while she looks at me like she is waiting for the other shoe to drop or for another god to snatch me away. We sit at the same table and eat the same bread, yet there is a sea between us that is wider than any I have ever sailed, because she knows the hero of the stories, but she does not know the man who was left behind on the shores of Troy. I have spent my whole life trying to get back here, he whispered as he looked up at the stars, which remained as cold and indifferent as the gods themselves. Now I am here, and I find that I do not know how to be a king of peace, because my hands only feel right when they are gripping a sword or a tiller. Telemachus treats me like a legend from a song instead of a father, and the people of Ithaca look at me with awe rather than affection. I am tired of being a legend, Euryclea, because legends do not get to sleep, and they certainly do not get to grow old with a quiet mind. The old nanny stood up with another small groan and pressed a kiss to the top of his head where the hair was beginning to turn the color of sea foam. You are just tired, my little fox, and you have always been too clever for your own good. You think you can outthink a prophecy just like you outthought the Trojans, but sometimes a man just needs to walk until his feet are sore enough to forget his heart. Now I am going to get some rest, because some of us have to face the morning while you stay out here talking to the shadows. She shuffled back toward the palace and left Odysseus alone in the flickering lamplight, where he remained for a very long time. He looked out over the dark water of the harbor and realized that the sea was still calling his name, even if it was only to tell him that his debt was coming due. A few days after that restless night in the courtyard, Odysseus decided that he could no longer bear the heavy silence of his own halls. So he gathered a small group of rowers and crossed the narrow sea to the mainland. He told himself that a king's first duty was to his land and his wealth, and since the suitors had turned his home into a butcher's shop, he felt a sudden and pressing need to inspect his distant estates in Elis. It was a fertile country of lush river valleys and low, oak-covered hills where the grass grew thick enough to hide a calf, and the air was sweet with the scent of clover rather than the sharp tang of salt. He spent his days traveling slowly from one farmstead to another while he stayed in the simple huts of his overseers and ate the coarse bread and goat's cheese of the mountain folk. He walked through the dusty corrals where the branding irons lay cold in the corners, and he spent long hours leaning against wooden fences while he watched the sunlight play across the backs of his mares. Odysseus obsessed over the smallest details of the harvest and the health of the foals, as if he were a man who intended to spend the next 30 years worrying about nothing more complicated than the price of wool or a dry spell in late August. He spoke with the old herdsman about the lineage of the bulls and the quality of the mountain pastures, while he carefully avoided any mention of the war or the long years he had spent upon the wine-dark water. When he looked at the sturdy, earthbound lives of these men who had never seen a trireme or a sea monster, he felt a pang of envy that was sharper than any wound he had ever received from a Trojan spear. He tried to convince himself that he was finally content and that the simple rhythm of the seasons was enough to satisfy a soul that had once traded insults with gods and navigated by the stars of the deep. Yet even in the quietest moments when he sat by the fire and listened to the lowing of the cattle, the memory of the underworld would return to him like a cold draft under a heavy door. He remembered how he had traveled to the very edge of the world where the sun never shines, and how he had dug a trench in the frozen earth to pour out the dark blood that the hungry dead so desperately craved. He could still see the shivering and gray silence of the land of shadows where the ghosts of his fallen comrades, and even his own mother, had crowded around him with hollow eyes while they begged for just one taste of life. In that terrible and breathless gloom, the blind prophet Tiresias had appeared before him, while he held a golden scepter that seemed to be the only solid thing in a world made of mist. The prophet had looked at him with eyes that saw the past and the future as clearly as a man might look at a map, and he told Odysseus that reaching Ithaca would not be the end of his labors, but merely the beginning of a final and strange reckoning. He told him that even after he had reclaimed his throne and dealt with the men who had feasted upon his life, he would still be a traveler who was bound to a wooden oar. Tiresias had stated quite clearly that Odysseus must take that oar upon his shoulder and walk away from the sea until he reached a land where people were so ignorant of the salt water that they would mistake his or for a winnowing fan used for grain. Only in that distant and dry place could he plant the wood in the earth and offer a rich sacrifice to Poseidon, so the god of the storms might finally let go of his ancient grudge. The prophet had promised that only after this final journey would death come to him gently, and from the sea, when he was a man of great age and surrounded by a peaceful people. Odysseus knew that by lingering in the pastures of Elis, he was only trying to bargain for a little more time, like a debtor who thinks that if he stays away from the marketplace long enough, his creditors might simply forget that he exists. He sat there and realized that he was a man who had won his home only to find that he was still a tenant of the gods, and that his lease required one more long and lonely walk into the dust. After his long walks among the silent hills of Elis, Odysseus finally turned his steps toward the court of King Polixenes, because even a man who is hiding from the gods must eventually observe the sacred laws of hospitality. The palace of the king was not like the limestone fortresses of the islands, but it was a sprawling and comfortable place of timber and sun-dried brick, where the smell of the hearth fires mingled with the earthy scent of the stables. Polixenes received him with the genuine warmth that one old soldier shows another, and he ordered that the baths be readied and the finest rugs be laid out in the great hall. As they sat together in the flickering torchlight of the evening feast, Odysseus felt the familiar rhythm of the symposium settle over him, although he knew that every cup of wine offered in friendship was also a reminder of the life he was still trying to outrun. When the main courses had been cleared and the servants brought forward the wine, Polixenes gestured for a special object to be carried into the center of the room. It was a massive silver crater of Sidonian craftsmanship, which stood with a quiet and moonlight grace that seemed to command the attention of everyone in the hall. This was the vessel meant for the mixing of the wine, and it was wide enough to hold the libations of a dozen men, while its surface was etched with such delicate skill that the figures seemed to move whenever the torchlight danced across the metal. Polixenes explained that this was his most precious heirloom, and he offered it to Odysseus as a gift of Xenia, because he believed that a man who had survived the walls of Troy deserved to drink from a vessel that told a story as complex as his own. Odysseus stood up and walked toward the silver bowl, while he watched the servants pour the thick and dark wine into the center before they tempered it with the clear and cold water of the mountain springs. He realized that this was the true image of a man's life, because in the heat of war everything had felt unmixed and pure, like the raw wine that leads to madness or the cold steel that leads to death. In this quiet hall he understood that a peaceful life required the difficult art of mixing, where the deep red of sorrow must be thinned by the clear water of everyday chores, and where no joy can ever be tasted without the diluting presence of an old grief. He looked into the swirling liquid and saw his own reflection as he understood that he had spent 20 years searching for an unmixed happiness, only to find that the gods never serve their gifts without a generous splash of bitterness. He leaned closer to the silver rim and began to trace the figures that the Sidonian masters had hammered into the metal with such haunting precision. The images told the story of Trophonius and Agamemnon, who were two brilliant brothers and architects who had built a magnificent treasury for King Odysseus with a secret that only they knew. They had placed a single stone in the wall so perfectly that it could be removed from the outside, which allowed them to steal the king's gold night after night, while the doors remained locked and the guards remained vigilant. Odysseus traced the scene where the trap was finally set, and where Agamemnon was caught by his foot in a hidden snare, while his brother stood over him with a raised sword. To save their family name, and to prevent the king from identifying the thief, Trophonius had been forced to cut off his own brother's head before he vanished into the earth. Odysseus pulled his hand away from the cool silver, as if the metal had suddenly turned to ice, because he saw his own soul reflected in the tragedy of the clever architects. He realized that, like Trophonius, he had spent his entire life using his wits to build secret passages and to escape the traps of giants and goddesses, yet all his cleverness had only led him to a place where he was forced to leave pieces of himself behind. The silver bowl whispered to him that even the most skillful trickster cannot outplan the finality of the grave, and that every secret door eventually leads to a room with no exit. As he looked at the gift from Polixenes, he understood that the cup was not just a vessel for wine, but it was a mirror of his own destiny, which reminded him that his debt to the sea must be paid before he too became nothing more than a figure etched in silver for another man to study in the dark. After his return from the fertile valleys of Elis, Odysseus did not linger in his halls because the silver mirror of the crater had stripped away his last excuses. He went to the inner chamber and took up the oar which had been waiting for him like a silent and wooden ghost, and he led 3 protesting animals from his remaining flocks, a ram, a bull, and a boar, into the rugged hills of Ithaca. As he began the long ascent toward the interior of the mainland, he felt every season of his half-century of life in the protest of his knees and the dull ache of his back, while he struggled to keep the sacrificial beasts from straying into the thickets. He looked at the heavy blade of the oar upon his shoulder and realized that all this labor and all those 10 years of wandering had their roots in a single moment of youthful vanity on the shores of the Cyclops Island. He remembered with a bitter clarity how he had stood on the deck of his ship and shouted his true name to the blinded Polyphemus because his pride was too great to let a victory go anonymous, even though silence would have saved the lives of his crew. He walked for many days through a landscape that became increasingly alien to a man of the islands because the air grew thin and the horizon was swallowed by jagged peaks of limestone and granite. He passed through villages where the people spoke a slower dialect, and where the smell of the sea was replaced by the scent of pine needles and damp earth as he climbed higher into the heart of the mountains. He watched the faces of the peasants who passed him on the road, and he felt a strange sense of detachment because they looked at him not as a king or a survivor of Troy, but as a traveler in his autumn years who was performing a task they did not understand. The beasts he led were tired, and their hooves were worn smooth by the mountain trails, while Odysseus himself felt as though he were shedding his own skin with every mile that took him further from the sound of the surf. He realized that he was walking away from the only world he had ever mastered, and that he was entering a realm where his cleverness was as useless as a sail in a forest. The long-awaited stillness finally found him on a high and desolate plateau where the wind spoke a language of stone and dry grass instead of tides. An old traveler, whose skin was as cracked as the parched earth, stopped to watch him pass with the sacrificial animals and the wooden burden upon his shoulder. The man leaned on his staff and squinted at the oar with an expression of pure and honest confusion before he asked why a weary traveler would carry a winnowing fan so deep into the mountains where the grain was already threshed and the wind was too fierce for such a tool. In that single question, the heavy chain of the past finally snapped because Odysseus realized that he had reached the border of the world where the sea was no longer a master, but a myth. The symbol of his long agony had been transformed by a stranger's ignorance into a common tool of the harvest, and he knew that he had finally outrun the reach of the waves. He set the sacrificial animals aside and began to dig a deep and narrow hole in the red earth with a bronze spade, while the silence of the mountains settled over him like a benediction. When the hole was deep enough, he took the oar and planted it upright in the soil so it stood straight and tall like a lonely mast in a sea of grass. He knelt in the dirt and began the ancient ritual of the sacrifice as he offered the ram, the bull, and the boar to Poseidon, the earth shaker, who rules the depths and moves the foundations of the world. He asked for the old grudge to be buried alongside the wood, and for the god of the storms to finally grant him the solid ground he had sought for 20 years. As the blood seeped into the thirsty ground, and the smoke of the burning fat rose toward the indifferent blue of the sky, Odysseus felt the invisible weight of his glory, and his grief finally slid from his shoulders. He looked at the oar, which was now just a piece of timber in a field, and he understood that he was no longer a hero of the songs, but simply a man who was free to walk home without looking back at the horizon. Odysseus began his descent from the high plateau with light shoulders, but a heavy heart, because the absence of a burden can sometimes be more disorienting than the weight of one. He walked back toward the coast and felt the dust of the road beneath his sandals while he realized that for the first time in 20 years no god was actively plotting his destruction. The sky remained a vast and indifferent blue, and the earth stayed firm beneath his feet, yet this newfound safety felt like a garment that was several sizes too large. He reached the cliffs overlooking the Ionian Sea and stood there for a long time as he watched the white foam batter the rocks below, while he waited for the familiar surge of fear or the sharp sting of divine anger. But there was nothing but the rhythmic breathing of the water and the cry of the gulls as he understood that the great debt had been cleared and the earth-shaker had truly turned his gaze elsewhere. Although the sea was no longer his enemy, it remained his most intimate ghost, because his body had been forged by the motion of the waves for so long that the stillness of the land felt like a lie. When he lay down to sleep in the quiet inns along the way, he found that he could not close his eyes because the bed did not sway and the roof did not creak with the strain of the wind. He would wake in the middle of the night with his hands clenching the blankets as if they were a tiller, and his ears would strain for the sound of a snapping sail or the roar of a coming storm. His knees still gave way slightly whenever he stood on a flat floor, because they were expecting the deck to rise up and meet them, and he realized with a quiet horror that he had spent so much time surviving the ocean that he had forgotten how to simply exist upon the shore. He finally walked through the gates of his own palace in Ithaca, and he watched as the servants went about their daily chores with a peaceful boredom that made him feel like a specter from another age. He sat at his table and looked at the sunlight streaming through the high windows while he felt a profound and aching loneliness because he had no one to fight and no riddle to solve. He tried to speak to Telemachus about the management of the vineyards, but he found that his thoughts kept drifting back to the smell of salt and the sight of the sun dipping below a horizon that never ended. He was a king who had no war and a father who had missed the childhood of his son and a husband who sat across from a wife whose silence was a language he had forgotten how to speak. Odysseus looked at his weathered hands and saw that they were trembling not from age but from the sheer pressure of a quiet that he did not know how to fill. He spent his evenings walking along the narrow strip of sand where the water met the land, because that was the only place where he felt truly himself. He would stand with his toes in the surf and watch the tide come in while he realized that while he had planted his, or in the dry earth of the mountains, he had left his spirit drifting somewhere out beyond the breakers. The world was moving on, and the songs were already being sung about his exploits, but Odysseus understood that the hardest journey of all was not the one across the sea, but the one that led from the hero he had been to the man he had to become. He was a sailor who had reached the harbor only to find that he no longer had a taste for the land, and he stood there in the twilight wondering if a heart that had been broken by the sea could ever truly be mended by the earth. The palace of Ithaca, which had once been the shimmering destination of all his dreams, had become a house of whispers where Odysseus and Penelope lived like two strangers sharing a lease on a memory. They sat across from each other at the evening table and shared the same bread and the same wine, but the silence between them was not the comfortable quiet of a long-lived life. It was the hollow silence of a ruin. For 20 years, they had both stayed faithful to a dream. Penelope to the memory of the young, clever fox who had left her bedside, and Odysseus to the image of the blooming girl who had waved him goodbye from the shore. Now that they were finally face to face, they found that the reality of their middle years was a clumsy intruder that neither of them knew how to entertain. They were like two actors who had studied different scripts for the same play, and the more they tried to force a connection, the more they felt the seams of their domestic life tearing under the pressure of 20 winters of separate growth. Odysseus realized that they were not in love with each other, but with the ghosts of who they used to be, and that no amount of shared meals could ever bridge the chasm created by a lifetime of missed glances and unshared breaths. The realization that he was a surplus in his own kingdom was not a sudden blow, but a slow and steady erosion of his spirit. He watched Telemachus command the respect of the elders and manage the vineyards with a steady hand, and he saw that his son had built a world that functioned perfectly without the presence of a legendary father. Odysseus stood in the courtyard and understood the bitter truth. He was a hero whose story had already been told, a man who was revered like a statue in a temple, but ignored like a living person at the hearth. He was tired of being a legend, and he was even more tired of trying to fit into a life that had long ago closed its gaps around his absence. Without a formal goodbye that would break the fragile peace of the palace, he gathered his gear and turned his back on Ithaca, seeking a horizon where his name did not already have a song attached to it. He set his course northward, away from the familiar islands and toward the rugged, mist-covered coast of Thesprotia, where the mountains rose like jagged teeth from a cold and churning sea. He arrived not as a king of the islands, but as a traveler with iron in his blood and a hunger for a life that didn't feel like a museum. It was here that he met Odyssey, the queen of the Thesprotians, who stood on the battlements with a wind-burnt face and eyes that searched the distance for enemies rather than myths. She did not ask him for a story of the sirens or the wooden horse. She looked at his weathered face and his scarred hands, and she saw a man who knew how to hold a line when the spears were falling like rain. She saw in him a warrior and a leader, a man of action whose worth was measured by the weight of his sword arm rather than the cleverness of his tongue. For the first time in more years than he could count, Odysseus felt the blood surge in his veins with the raw heat of the present moment. Odyssey did not want the great Odysseus of the poems. She wanted the man who stood before her, a soldier who could help her defend her land from the savage Bragi tribes, and a king who could rule with a steady and unsentimental hand. In her gaze, he was not a ghost or a disappointment. He was a vital and necessary force, a man whose presence made the world feel solid once again. He felt the heavy weight of his past fall away into the gray mists of the northern coast because here, in this cold and dangerous land, he could finally stop remembering and start living. He looked at Odyssey and the war that lay ahead, and he realized that he wanted to stay, not for the sake of a throne, but for the chance to be a man whose life was happening right now instead of 20 years ago. The union between Odysseus and Odyssey was not a matter of poets and liars, but a compact of strength and necessity that felt more honest than any vow he had taken in his youth. There were no golden chariots or delicate veils, only the gray stone of the Thesprotian altars and the cold wind that howled through the mountain passes like a witness to their resolve. Odysseus stood beside the queen and felt the weight of a new mantle upon his shoulders, not the inherited purple of Ithaca, but the heavy furs of a northern warlord. As they drank from the ceremonial cup, he looked into Odyssey's steady eyes and saw a reflection of a man he could finally respect, a man who was chosen for his scars and his wisdom rather than his lineage. He became the king of the Thesprotians by the right of his sword and the clarity of his counsel, and for the first time in decades, the taste of the present moment was stronger than the bitter aftertaste of his memories. He threw himself into the work of ruling with a desperate and silent hunger, as if by building a new world he could finally bury the ruins of the old one. Odysseus spent his days reorganizing the scattered tribes and teaching the mountain warriors the disciplined tactics he had learned on the plains of Troy. He did not talk of the wooden horse. He talked of logistics, of supply lines, and of the way a shield wall must breathe to survive the charge of the savage Bragi. He sat in the low-ceilinged halls of the north and settled disputes over grazing rights and blood feuds with a hard-earned fairness that won him a loyalty Ithaca had never quite offered. He was no longer a legend returning from the dead. He was a living king who walked the ramparts at dawn and whose voice was heard in the councils of war. And in this labor, he found a strange and gritty kind of peace. The final anchor to this new life arrived not with a fleet of ships, but with the sharp and piercing cry of a newborn son. When Odyssey placed the infant Polypides in his arms, Odysseus felt a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with age or the cold of the northern winter. He looked down at the child's face, a face that knew nothing of Penelope, nothing of the suitors, and nothing of the 20 years of salt and blood, and he felt a profound sense of absolution. He named the boy Polypides, and as he held him against his weathered chest, he realized that he had been given the one thing he thought the gods had stolen forever, a second chance to be a father without the shadow of a tragedy looming over the cradle. He was not a ghost in this nursery. He was a provider and a protector whose presence was the only world the child knew. As he watched his new son grow in the mist-shrouded valleys of Thesprotia, Odysseus allowed himself to believe that he had finally outwitted fate herself. He was a husband to a woman who challenged his mind, a father to a son who looked at him with uncomplicated love, and a king to a people who needed his strength. He walked through the halls of his new palace and felt the solid earth beneath his boots, telling himself that the ore he had planted in the mountains had truly grown roots. Yet, in the quietest hours of the night, when the wind shifted and brought the faint, impossible scent of salt from the distant coast, he would find himself holding his breath. He was a man who had built a magnificent new life on the wreckage of the old one. But deep in his soul, he knew that the sea never truly forgets a debt, and that even the strongest walls of the north could not keep out the ghosts that were already starting to gather at the border. The peace of the northern valleys was finally shattered not by a whisper, but by the rhythmic thunder of 1,000 boots and the harsh clatter of iron. The wild Brygi tribes, like a seasonal flood of bronze and wolf skins, poured over the mountain passes to reclaim the lands that Odyssey had brought under her rule. Odysseus felt the familiar chill of adrenaline in his blood as he donned his old armor, which felt surprisingly light after the heavy silence of the palace. He took his place at the head of the Thesprotian army, not as a weary traveler, but as a seasoned predator who had spent a lifetime studying the geometry of slaughter. He realized that while he had tried to bury the warrior in the saltless earth of the mountains, the scent of approaching battle was the only thing that made him feel truly awake. The battle took place on a wide, sloping plain where the morning mist clung to the grass like a shroud. Odysseus commanded the line with a cold and terrifying efficiency, his voice cutting through the din of clashing shields like a bronze bell. He watched as the Brygi charged, a chaotic wave of raw fury, and he met them with the disciplined wall of spears he had spent months perfecting. For a few hours, he was just a general managing the flow of blood and the placement of reserves, but as the sun reached its zenith, the air began to shimmer with a heat that had nothing to do with the summer. The atmosphere grew thick and heavy, and Odysseus felt a sudden prickling on his skin, the unmistakable signature of the divine. Then, the veil between the worlds tore open. Above the struggling masses of men, Odysseus saw the terrifying brilliance of Ares, the god of carnage, who descended like a crimson comet into the ranks of the Brygi, driving them into a frenzy of mindless violence. Beside him, or perhaps against him, stood Athena, her aegis shining with a light so cold and sharp it seemed to pierce the very souls of the combatants. They did not strike at the soldiers. They moved through the battlefield like giants in a puppet theater, their movements dictating the rise and fall of the morale, the snapping of spear shafts, and the sudden, inexplicable bursts of courage or cowardice. Odysseus stood frozen as he watched the gods play their ancient game, and he realized with a sickening clarity that the victory he had so carefully planned was merely a side effect of a much larger and more indifferent celestial argument. As the brigee finally broke and fled, leaving the ground red and the air filled with the groans of the dying, Odysseus lowered his sword and felt a profound sense of exhaustion that reached into his very soul. He looked up at the empty sky where the shimmer of the immortals was already fading into the blue, and he found himself gripped by a question that was sharper than any spear. He stood in the center of the carnage and wondered where his own will ended and the divine plan began, because he had spent a lifetime believing in his own cunning only to see that the gods could overturn his best-laid schemes with a single glance. He asked himself what part of this victory truly belonged to him. Was it the years of training his men, or was it merely the whim of Athena that had kept his shield from shattering? He stood there in the cooling air and tried to find the line where a man must act and where he must surrender to the tide of fate. He realized that perhaps the true wisdom was not in outsmarting the gods, but in knowing which battles were his to fight and which belonged to the heavens. If his whole life was a tapestry woven by unseen hands, then what was the value of his choices and his suffering? Odysseus looked at the blood upon his hands and understood that while he could not control the storm, he could still choose how to hold the rudder, and that even a pawn has the power to move forward. He remained on the field long after the echoes of the war had died down, while he tried to distinguish the solid ground of his own character from the shifting sands of divine favor, seeking the courage to act where it mattered and the humility to accept what he could never change. As the years in Thesprotia turned into decades, Odysseus discovered a cruel paradox of the human heart. When Penelope had been close, the friction of their long-separated lives had made her feel like a burden, a reminder of a past that no longer fit. But now that she was once again a distant shore, she had transformed back into the golden dream he had loved during his years on the sea. Beside him every day was Odyssey, flesh and blood, real and present. And the more real his second life became, the more he looked back at Ithaca with a tender longing. He realized that he was a man who loved the horizon more than the hearth, and that Penelope had become more precious to him as a memory than she had been as a wife. He sat in the quiet of his northern hall and finally faced the truth he had been outrunning since he first planted his oar in the saltless earth. His flight to Thesprotia was a desperate attempt to keep himself young, to remain the needed hero in a world that was moving on. He had tried to trade his old scars for new ones, believing that a different throne and a different woman would grant him a different soul. But he realized that you can change the sky and the soil, but you always take yourself with you. There is no shore far enough to escape the person you have become. The second marriage had been a mirror designed to show him that his true struggle was internal. He saw now that his attempt to save his youth by starting over was a path that led nowhere, a circle drawn in the dust. He had spent his energy trying to preserve the man he used to be, the king, the warrior, instead of allowing that man to die so that something wiser could be born. He realized that the joy and the true taste of life did not lie in finding a better life, but in the courage to grow beyond the need for one. Wisdom was not in holding on, but in rising above, in moving from the hero who conquers to the sage who understands. Odysseus stood on the battlements and felt a newfound lightness. He no longer blamed the gods for his exile. He understood that this second life had been given to him as a final lesson, to show him that he was the architect of his own prisons. The flavor of life was not in the wine of a new wedding or the blood of a new war, but in the quiet realization that he was ready to stop running. He was finally prepared to grow, not as a king trying to be young, but as a man who had grown large enough to contain both his homes and all his mistakes within a single, peaceful heart. The end of the Thesprotian chapter began not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, rhythmic fading of a heart that had given all it had to give. Odyssey, the woman who had seen the warrior beneath the legend, fell into a sleep from which the cold northern dawn could not wake her. Odysseus sat by her side and watched the light leave her eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt no urge to bargain with the gods or to use his cunning to cheat the grave. He felt only a profound and heavy stillness because he understood that their contract of necessity and strength had been fulfilled. As he closed her eyes, he realized that the iron bond that had held him to this northern soil had snapped, and the halls of the palace suddenly felt as vast and empty as a shipwreck on a forgotten shore. He stood in the shadows of the great hall and watched as his son, Polypides, took up the heavy crown of the Thesprotians. The boy had grown into a man of steady gaze and broad shoulders, a leader who was loved by the mountain tribes and who needed no advice from a ghost of the past. Odysseus saw his own reflection in his son's eyes and understood the finality of the moment. His work here was done. He was no longer the king, no longer the provider, and no longer the vital force that held the kingdom together. He was a guest in a house he had built, a legend that had lingered too long at the feast. With a silent nod of blessing, he turned away from the throne, knowing that for Polypides to truly rule, the shadow of the great Odysseus had to vanish from the valley. High above the mists of the earth, in the timeless silence where the threads of existence are spun, the Moirai paused in their eternal labor. The three sisters, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, looked down upon the aging traveler and saw that the tangled knots of his spirit had finally been smoothed out by the hands of time and the weight of his own realizations. They saw that he had stopped fighting the tide and had finally understood the shape of his own soul. With a movement as swift and silent as a thought, Atropos reached out with her silver shears and snipped the thread of his Thesprotian life. It was not an act of cruelty, but a gesture of mercy. The lesson had been learned, the stage had been cleared, and the thread was now free to be woven into its final, inevitable pattern. Odysseus walked out of the palace gates with nothing but his old cloak and a staff, feeling a strange and ethereal lightness in his limbs. The air of the mountains no longer tasted of pine and earth, but began to carry a sharp, familiar tang that shouldn't have been there, the scent of salt and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the Ionian Sea. He realized that while he had spent 20 years trying to outrun his past, and another 20 trying to build a new future, both paths had finally led him back to the same destination. He didn't feel the fear of an old man or the desperation of an exile. He felt the quiet anticipation of a sailor who finally hears the call of the home port. He turned his face southward, toward Ithaca, not because he hoped to reclaim a throne, but because he knew that the circle was almost complete and that every soul must eventually return to the place where its story began. The return to Ithaca was not the triumph of a king or the desperate crawl of a survivor. It was the quiet, weary drifting of a leaf settling onto the gray surface of a pond. Odysseus stepped onto the familiar sand of the harbor, and though the sun hit the limestone cliffs with the same ancient light, the air felt thin and drained of its magic. He walked toward the palace with a slow, heavy gait, his staff tapping against the stones like the heartbeat of a man who has already seen the end of his own story. He was no longer looking for the thrill of recognition or the warmth of a feast. He was simply a tired traveler returning to a room that had long ago been cleared of his belongings. When he entered the hall, Penelope was there, but she did not drop her spindle or cry out. She rose with a slow, deliberate dignity that felt like a shield. As they looked at each other, Odysseus saw that the chasm between them had grown so vast that even a god's bridge could not span it. The silence that filled the room was not the awkwardness of strangers, but the profound, icy cold of two people who had once known everything about each other and now knew nothing at all. Her eyes held no anger, only a devastating, polite indifference, the kind of look one gives to a ghost that has overstayed its haunting. The woman he had spent a lifetime dreaming of had finally vanished, leaving behind a queen who had learned to survive the winter of his absence by freezing her own heart. The sharpest blow came when a man of some 20 years stepped out from the shadows of the pillars, tall, stern, and wearing the face Odysseus had seen in his own mirror long ago. This was Polyporus, the son born of his last, brief night on Ithaca before he fled to the north. Odysseus looked at this grown man and felt a sickening wave of failure wash over him. He realized the bitter irony of his life. While he had been in Thesprotia, laboring to be a perfect father to Polypides and thinking he was redeeming his soul, his other son here on Ithaca had grown into manhood without ever hearing his voice. He had not started over. He had simply repeated the same betrayal. He had left yet another son to grow in the shade of a legend, and another wife to endure the silence of a husband's second desertion. In the weeks that followed, the palace of Ithaca became a tomb of unsaid words. Odysseus and Penelope moved through the same halls like phantoms in separate dimensions. There was no warmth in their shared meals, no spark in their occasional conversations, only the dry, hollow etiquette of a marriage that had died of exhaustion. He saw that Penelope had moved beyond him. She was a woman who had already mourned him twice and had no more tears left for his third arrival. The abyss between them was now absolute. Odysseus understood that he had committed the ultimate error. He had tried to save his youth by running away, only to find that he had brought the same fractured man to two different shores. He sat by the hearth and watched the dying embers. The restlessness that had defined Odysseus's life, the fire that had driven him across oceans and through the halls of foreign queens, had finally flickered out, leaving only the cool, gray ash of acceptance. He spent his days sitting on the high cliffs of Ithaca, his back against the sun-warmed stone, watching the relentless movement of the tides. His body, once a masterpiece of muscle and scars, now felt like a borrowed garment that no longer fit. Every breath was a conscious effort, and the staff that had once been a traveler's tool was now his only connection to the solid earth. He didn't feel the bitterness of a defeated man. He felt the profound, quiet relief of a runner who finally sees the finish line in the distance. He looked out over the Ionian Sea, and for the first time in 80 years, he didn't see a monster to be fought or a distance to be conquered. The waves, which had once been his greatest enemy and his cruelest jailer, now looked like a vast, unrolled shroud of blue silk. The salt spray no longer stung his eyes. It felt like a familiar greeting from an old friend. He realized that the water was not a threat, but a promise of absolute stillness. The sea had taken everything from him: his youth, his friends, his peace. And now it was offering him the only thing he had left to receive: a silence deep enough to swallow all his memories and all his mistakes. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the waves in shades of bruised purple and dying gold, Odysseus felt the approach of the end with a clarity that was almost beautiful. He didn't look back at his palaces, neither the one in Ithaca nor the one in the north. He didn't call for his sons or for the woman who sat in the silent hall behind him. He understood that death was the only journey he had to take entirely alone, without a map, without a crew, and without a clever plan to survive. The shadows lengthening across the rocks were not frightening. They were the closing of a long, heavy book. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythmic pulse of the surf, finding a strange joy in the realization that he no longer needed to be Odysseus the Great. He only needed to be a man ready to return to the elements. He sat in the deepening twilight, a solitary figure carved against the darkening sky, and felt the last of his burdens slide away. The game of the gods was over, the threads of the moirai were spent, and the two lives he had lived had finally merged into a single point of light. He wasn't waiting for a tragedy. He was waiting for an invitation. He felt a sense of immense gratitude for the weariness that now filled his bones, for it was the only thing that made the prospect of the void so welcoming. As the first stars began to pierce the velvet dark, Odysseus smiled into the wind, finally understanding that the greatest victory of his long and turbulent life was not in surviving the storm, but in the quiet, fearless willingness to let the waves carry him home to the nothingness from which he came. The quiet of the afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless head shepherd. He didn't speak of fate or gods, but of cold, hard losses. A foreign ship had breached the southern cove, and a raiding party was systematically emptying the royal pens. Dozens of prime cattle and sheep were already being driven toward the shore. For Odysseus, who had spent the last years in a fog of reflection, this was a sharp, grounding jolt. The great king was momentarily replaced by the great landowner. Theft on this scale was not just a crime. It was a direct challenge to the stability of Ithaca and the authority he had spent a lifetime defending. As more messengers arrived, the administrative details became clear. The raiders weren't professional soldiers from a rival city-state, but they were well-armed and organized. They had struck the outlying farms first, taking advantage of the thin security on the coast. Odysseus listened to the tally of stolen livestock and damaged property with a grim, focused energy. He didn't wonder about the identity of the invaders or the scent of magic. To him, they were simply pirates who had made the fatal mistake of thinking the old lion was too frail to guard his territory. Odysseus didn't waste time on speeches or prayers. He stood up, felt the ache in his joints, and ignored it. He ordered his old armor to be brought out, not as a ceremonial relic, but as necessary equipment for a police action. He sent word to the local militia and prepared to head out. This wasn't about glory or a final encounter. It was about restoring the rule of law on his island. He was annoyed that his peace had been disturbed by such a common, thuggish provocation, and he intended to settle the matter as efficiently as possible. He walked out of the palace not as a mythic hero, but as a sovereign going to collect a debt in blood. He moved toward the south at a steady, military pace, calculating the terrain and the best point to intercept the thieves. He could hear the distant lowing of his cattle, his property, the wealth of his kingdom, and it fueled a cold, pragmatic resolve. He didn't know the young man on the beach was his son, and he didn't care. He only saw a trespasser who was disrupting the administrative peace of Ithaca, and Odysseus was going to ensure that the cost of this raid would be higher than any pirate could afford to pay. Odysseus reached the coastal dunes not as a man seeking a duel of honor, but as a commander assessing a tactical problem. He saw the raiders clustered near the shore, their formation undisciplined but their movements dangerous. At the center stood a young man who radiated a natural, terrifying authority. To Odysseus, this was simply the enemy commander, a target that needed to be neutralized to break the raid. He didn't look for a family resemblance or wait for a sign from the gods. He tightened his grip on his spear and moved to intercept the youth before the stolen cattle could be loaded onto the black ship. Telegonus watched the old man approach with a mixture of contempt and battle lust. He had come to Ithaca looking for the legendary Odysseus, but he saw only a weathered veteran in outdated armor. He had no idea that the man in his sights was the father he had spent his life imagining. To Telegonus, this was just another local defender, a stubborn obstacle in the path of his first great conquest. He laughed, spinning his strange, shimmering spear with easy mastery, eager to prove his strength against the most formidable-looking soldier the island had to offer. The fight began with a sudden, violent collision. Odysseus realized immediately that he was facing a fighter unlike any he had encountered in decades. The boy was faster than any mortal man had a right to be, his movements fluid and unpredictable. Odysseus used every ounce of his experience, parrying blows that would have shattered a younger man's shield, and using the terrain to compensate for his stiffening joints. They traded strikes in a blur of bronze and sweat, two strangers locked in a lethal dance, each admiring the other's skill while seeking the opening that would end the other's life. The air was thick with the sounds of heavy breathing and the ring of metal, but there was no dialogue. They fought in a grim, focused silence. Odysseus saw the boy's talent and felt a flicker of professional respect. It was a waste that such a gifted warrior was a mere pirate. Telegonus, in turn, was surprised by the old man's tenacity and the sheer weight behind his strikes. Neither could see past the mask of the enemy. The blood that spilled on the sand was shared, yet they remained miles apart. They were two generations of the same line, separated by a wall of secrets and 30 years of silence, trying to kill the only mirror they had in the world. Decades ago, in the choking mists of the underworld, the blind prophet Tiresias had leaned forward and whispered a riddle that Odysseus had carried in his heart through every storm and every victory. The ghost's voice had been dry as dead leaves. Asterisk. And death shall come to you from the sea, a death so gentle, and it shall lay you low when you are overcome with sleek old age, and your people shall be dwelling in prosperity around you. Asterisk 4 years. Odysseus had looked at the crashing waves and expected a shipwreck or a tidal wave. He never imagined that, from the sea, meant something as small and silent as a single point of bone. The end did not come with the roar of a battlefield or a shattering blow. In the middle of the chaotic scuffle on the beach, as Odysseus moved to disarm the young stranger, there was a momentary lapse, a fraction of a second where age betrayed him. Telegonus, frantic and cornered, lunged forward with his strange spear. It wasn't a deep, dismembering strike. It was a mere graze, a sharp sting that pierced the skin just above the hip. The spearhead, carved from the venomous spine of a stingray, left only a thin, dark line of blood. At first, Odysseus didn't even fall. He stood still, looking at the boy, feeling a strange, creeping numbness that began at the wound and moved upward like a cold tide. The venom of the deep sea worked with a terrifying, quiet efficiency. Odysseus felt his legs grow heavy, then weightless. He sank to the sand, not in agony, but as if the strength was simply being drained out of him by a siphon. The world around him, the shouting raiders, the lowing cattle, the panicked servants, began to blur into a soft, golden haze. This was the gentle death Tiresias had promised. The poison acted as a key, unlocking the tether between his weary soul and his battered body. There was no struggle, no gasping for air. There was only a profound sense of release, as if he were a ship finally slipping its moorings after 1,000 years at sea. As he lay there, looking up at the sky, the rhythmic sound of the waves seemed to sync with his slowing heartbeat. The sea had not come for him with teeth and fury. It had sent a messenger of silence. He looked at the tip of the spear that had grazed him, a gift from the ocean's depths, and realized that the water was finally reclaiming its own. The salt in his blood was merging with the salt of the Ionian tide. He felt a strange gratitude for the boy who had delivered the stroke. Without knowing it, the stranger had granted him the one thing Odysseus could never find for himself: the permission to stop fighting and finally go home to the dark, quiet peace of the elements. As Odysseus lay paralyzed by the stingray's poison, the young warrior stood over him, trembling with a strange, sudden fear. "Who are you, old man?" the youth demanded, his voice shaking. "You fight like a god, yet you fall to a single touch." Odysseus looked at the boy's spear and then at the golden ring on the youth's finger, a ring he had seen once before, in the soft light of a palace that smelled of cedar and magic. "The spear," Odysseus whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Only one island grows such spines. Only one woman knows how to tip them with the silence of the deep. Tell me, boy, does Circe still walk the halls of Iliad? And is it her blood that gives your eyes that amber fire?" The youth froze, the name of his mother acting like a physical blow. He fell to his knees, his arrogance vanishing in an instant. "I am Telegonus," he stammered, "son of Circe. She sent me. She gave me this spear and told me to find the king of Ithaca. She told me to find the man who sailed away and never looked back. She told me to find my father." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the waves. Telegonus looked at the weathered, dying man before him, the man he had just struck, and realized that his desperate search had led him to the one person he had crossed the world to protect. Odysseus let out a soft, rattling laugh that turned into a cough. "So," he murmured, "I sought a new life in the north to save one son, only to be found by another on my own shore. My boy, you have your mother's beauty and my own cursed luck." He saw the horror in Telegonus's eyes as the boy realized he had fulfilled the prophecy of the sea with his own hand. "Do not weep," Odysseus said, his hand groping blindly until it found the boy's shoulder. "I asked the gods for a way out of this dust. You haven't brought me a crime. You've brought me a key. You found me, Telegonus. At the very last moment, you found me." Odysseus felt the poison reach his throat, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He looked out at the horizon one last time, then back at his son. "Go to the palace," he whispered, his eyes beginning to cloud, yet shining with a final, peaceful realization. "Tell Penelope, tell Telemachus, it truly did come from the sea, and it truly is gentle." He felt the cold tide of the stingray's gift merge with the salt in his blood, and he finally understood the blind prophet's riddle. With a soft exhale, the great wanderer let go of the world, leaving a smile on his lips as the only answer to a lifetime of storms. The silence that followed Odysseus's last breath was broken by a shimmering change in the air. A golden mist rolled in from the sea, and from it stepped Circe, the sorceress of Aea. She did not come as a grieving lover, but as a weaver of destinies. With a touch of her wand, she ensured that the spirit of Odysseus would not wander the gray gloom of Hades, but would be carried to the Blessed Isles, to Elysium. There, in the eternal meadows, Odysseus found the one thing his restless heart had always lacked, a horizon that did not demand to be crossed. Before him, there was no calling sea. Beneath his feet, no wooden deck, and the gods no longer played with his life. He sat by a crystal pool, finally anchored in a peace as vast as the stars themselves. The great wanderer was home, resting in the stillness he had spent a lifetime running from. He no longer had to sail, no longer had to fight, and no longer had to wait. On the earthly shores of Ithaca, the world of the living continued its strange dance. To heal the wounds of the tragedy, Circe orchestrated a final, paradoxical union. Telemachus, the son of the house, found a new destiny in the arms of Circe herself, taking his father's place in the halls of Aea. Meanwhile, Penelope, whose long wait had finally ended, found protection and a new beginning in the strength of Telegonus. It was a conclusion that only the gods could have written, a complex tapestry where fathers and sons, queens and sorceresses swapped roles. From this bond between the son of the sea and the queen of the land, a child was born who was destined to change the map of the world. His name was Italus. World Italus grew under the shadow of his grandfather's legends, but his eyes were fixed on the distant northern and western reaches. Upon reaching manhood, he led a great migration across the Ionian Sea, reaching the rugged and fertile shores of the peninsula at the edge of the known world. Italus became the legendary leader and lawgiver who transformed scattered tribes into a unified people, the Italics. The blood of Odysseus, filtered through the wisdom of Penelope and the magic of Circe, took root in this new soil. Thus, from the wreckage of one hero's journey, Italy was born, a legacy of stone and law arising from salt and myth, eventually destined to eclipse even the greatness of ancient Troy. In the golden quiet of Elysium, Odysseus watched as his name transformed from that of a man into the name of an entire country. He saw that his wanderings had not been a series of accidents, but the sowing of seeds for the future. He smiled, feeling the weight of the years finally lift from his shoulders. His journey had not ended on a beach in Ithaca. It had expanded to fill the history of centuries to come. The great wanderer closed his eyes, content that the silence of the blessed isles had merged with the rising dawn of a new era. For those who leave likes and comments on the channel, the ancient god of dreams, Morpheus, sets aside dreams from a special shining box, decorated with a green branch. These are some of the finest dreams you will have since you stopped being children. So let the night wrap around you, and let the legend of the greatest warrior of the Trojan War carry you gently into sleep.